I get asked a lot of times about my mixing process, how I mix my beats, what do I do? Do I track them out? I get this question over and over again, so I just decided to make a video and talk about my process of making beats regarding mixing. I won't be showing you how I use EQs. There will be no moving parameters in this video or anything, just in case you're wondering. This is just about my concept behind making beats. I've been putting this video off for a very, very long time, and that's because there's nothing special about my mixing process. I developed this method of mixing that is just very lazy, but it does what I want it to do. And I like the end result of it. I'm not 100% happy about my mixes, but it's something that I'm happy with, and I've kind of created this workflow that works out for me in the end. I am not a mixing engineer. I'm far from being a mixing engineer. What I do is not the correct way of doing things, and it's not even close to a conventional way of doing things. I look at this more as an art form, and to me there aren't really rules to this, and there aren't any rules to mixing. There are good practices and bad practices. In the past, I did make my beats on the MPC, and then I would record track per track into my DAW and then mix it. I hated that process. I still do, and I actually stopped doing it. I don't export my tracks. I finish everything inside of the Excel. So what I do is I mix everything inside of the Excel. So all the levels, all the panning is done right here. And that to me is the most important thing about mixing, is levels and panning. And that's it. I don't use EQs at all. That's one of the things that I don't do. I don't use actually plugins. My beat making process, it's very, very, very simple. One of the things that I do to kind of compensate for the lack of EQing is using a lot of filters. This started changing when I got into the MPC Renaissance. I was using more and more filters because you have different type of filters. Instead of using the EQ to tone down certain frequencies, I was using filters for that, or band pass, low pass, high pass, depending on the sample. And I just got used to working that way. And nowadays, that's all I do. I just use levels, panning, and filters. I don't use anything else. That's it. So, I might have a sample and it has a lot of bass. What I do is filter it, okay, and add a low pass to it. What I do normally is resample everything. So, do something like that to the sample where I high pass it and then resample it back in and drop it inside of my mix. Again, always being careful with the levels. That to me is the most important thing to me, is volume. I especially like filters because they color the sound. I fell in love with just using filters, and that's one of the reasons why I got my analog heat as well, because I wanted to go deeper into filtering samples. I just really like the way they sound. Obviously, you don't need analog heat. The filters inside of the MPCs are really good. I've been using them a lot, and sometimes I prefer to use those filters. So that's basically how I mix my music, is adding filters to my samples, being careful with the volumes, and always panning stuff just so I can open up the mix a little bit. So I always mix while I'm producing. I'm making my beat, and I'm always checking for the levels, seeing if my snare is too high. If my main sample, I always have some chords in the back, always checking if I need to lower those chords so the other samples can be heard in the mix. So I constantly look for the volume. I always check volumes, always increase the volume, lower the volume until I feel like there's a balance between all of the samples and everything can be heard. A big problem that I see with a lot of beat makers is that they don't use good kicks, good snares That's one of the most important things about my beat making, is that I always have a folder with kicks and snares that I love and that I know that fit my style of mixing and my style of production. So always have something that has bass. I always have a kick that has bass in it. So yeah, very, very crucial to choose good kicks, good snares off the bat. Because I use samples, a lot of the times it doesn't really, I feel the need to compress stuff or to EQ things, because these are samples. These samples have already been mixed by engineers. These samples already went through compressors, already went through EQs. So, when I sample something, I already enjoy the sound of the sample. I don't really want to change that, because if I'm sampling something, it's because I like the way it sounds. I might just add a low pass or a high pass because it might be conflicting with other samples. And sometimes I like to add a little bit of resonance so it brings out certain areas of the sample. But because I'm sampling, I don't really feel the need to EQ that much. It's if I was working with synthesizers, working with real live musicians, that's a complete different story. You're going to need compression to level out different hits from a drummer. Obviously, if I was working with real musicians, I would have to use EQs to attenuate frequencies, and I would have to use EQs to boost up other frequencies. But because I'm working with samples, the kick is always going to be the same kick. I don't need to compress my kicks because they're not on different levels. They're always the same kick, and it's always the same snare. You understand? Like the reason why the compressor was invented was to level out the recordings. So hits that would sound really, really high and compared to the other ones that you couldn't really hear that much because they were very soft hits. So you would have to compress the audio to make them all kind of be at the same level or be closer together in levels. So that's the reason why they invented compressors. I don't really use any compression on my kicks, snares. I don't use EQs, again, because I don't feel the need to do that unless I want to change the sound of the snare, and I can use filters for that. At the end of the day, what I do, and what I think most people that are watching this video do as well, is lo-fi, boom bap. You can create a bad mix and it sounds good because that's the characteristic of lo-fi. It's because it's grainy, there's some distortion. Because of that, I think we're quite lucky because there's really no standard way of mixing lo-fi music. It's all in your ears and how you see your beat. I could have I may prefer a beat sounding like this. With no highs at all. And that might be the way that I actually want my beat to be heard. You might want your beat to be heard that way. With more highs. It really depends because this is lo-fi and you can paint your beat in many different ways because it's lo-fi. If this was like pop music, you would really have to follow the industry standards on how everything sounds. We're not restrained to a specific type of mixing that for the industry. It's really up to you how you want to paint it, and don't try to understand how EQing works and how compression works so you can use it in your beats, but don't feel forced to have a beat sound a certain way just because other beat makers do it that way. Just find your color, find your music. One of the things that you might want to do if you're struggling with your mixes is to use reference tracks. So using reference tracks really helps because it allows you to listen to other people's music that you love, and that way you can have a sense to how your beat is going to sound. So you can listen to the beat and go, okay, so my kicks sound a little bit too high. I might need to turn this down a little bit, maybe boost up the hi-hats, or, using reference tracks really helps. And if you're struggling with your mixes, it's a great way to kind of compare your beat to the other person's beat and just have a sense to maybe what you can do to your mix to improve your mix. But that's it. I mean, as I said at the beginning, I'm not a mixing engineer. I mean, I can't really tell you how to mix your beats. I kind of found this way of doing it and it works out for me. I'm not trying to make pop music where everything sounds super clean, which I don't like. Actually, I'll tell you that there were a couple of bands here in Portugal, hip-hop bands, that when they were at the beginning, all their music was sounding really rusty and punk and dirty, and I just loved the way they sounded. Once they started to make more music geared toward more public, it started to sound more pop. Everything was super clean. All the mixes were just super, super clean, and I stopped listening to them. So a clean mix doesn't really mean that it's going to be better. To me, it actually doesn't mean it's going to be better. I really love my music to sound dirty. The other day I used my tape recorder, and I just really loved the way it sounded. It sounded dirty, and it sounded with tape saturation. And that's the way I like listening to my beats, really. It doesn't mean that you need to do that you need to do what I do to make your beats sound good. This comes from an individual person, and it depends on how you want your beats to be heard. So that's really the direction I'm going with my music at the moment. It doesn't mean that in the future I won't use EQs. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that at the moment, this is how I'm working, okay? And I'm having a lot of fun just doing it this way, resample my samples through the analog or through the SP, giving it some filtering, giving it a different color, bringing it to a new light, and then sequencing everything, stereo out into my DAW, and that's it. That's how I do it. It's really a very minimalistic, simplistic way of doing it. But that's what I love. It's that it's simple. I don't lose immense hours trying to mix and master everything like precisely, which I know it's not going to happen. I forgot to mention, yes, there's a point that I do use an EQ and a compressor, and that's right at the end. So when this comes out, it goes into my DAW. I do a mastering part where I EQ everything at the end. Actually, that's what I'm using the heat as well. Everything runs through the heat. I give it a bit of EQ in, and then inside of my DAW, I then compress everything, add a limiter to it, boost it up a little bit, and that's it. That's when I use a compressor. But apart from that, there are no compressors running in here. There's no EQ or anything, just filters, samples, volumes, panning, and that's it. Again, thank you so much for watching the video. Please subscribe, do that thumbs up to help the channel grow, and I'll see you on the next video. Peace.